welcome everyone. My name is Susan Eley and welcome to our first ever online opening reception to celebrate our third virtual show since the pandemic began. We hope you brought your own wine and cheese, as that we can't supply, but we do, yay Eric, great, but we do hope to offer a spirited discussion and engaging talk. Over the next hour, just so you know what will happen, I'm going to introduce Emily Miraglia, who's the curator of the show. I'm going to introduce just a bit about what the show is, where the title comes from. And then Emily is going to take over and have a discussion with all four artists in the show, who are all here on board. We've got James Isherwood, Charles Buckley, Rachel Burgess, and Maria Passarotti. So everyone, artist wave.
Hi.
Great, thanks. We would love questions and comments from everyone. So feel free to wave and we can call on you or put any comments or questions in the chat and we'll be monitoring that as best as we can. So a bit about the exhibition. It's called Americana. It's a two-part show running through the summer. And curator Emily, who is gallery associate for Susan Eley Fine Art, has a BFA in photography and related media from FIT in New York. A bit on the word Americana. When we think of this word, what comes to mind is nostalgia, things that reflect an America of time gone by and a harking back to a better, simpler time. The dictionary definition of Americana is materials concerning or characteristic of America, its civilization or its culture. More broadly, things typical of America. While Americana was curated before the murder of George Floyd and the ensuing protests, we would be remiss to not mention this current state of affairs as having upended any comfortable, idealized perceptions or notions about our country we may still have held on to even in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. As we all have discussions about the intrinsic racism that runs rampant through our police departments and other institutions, it may be difficult to look at the images in this show without reading between the lines and sensing an undercurrent of angst and discomfort. And we very much do invite you to do so and hope you'll inject comments accordingly. So now to Emily. What does this word Americana mean to you? How did you come up with the concept for the show?
So I have always been interested in American history and ideas and themes that are supposedly uniquely American. So things like the small town archetype, car culture, ideas of freedom and hard work, things like the individual versus the group, and the idea of the American dream. So you defined America, and the correct definition is, things relating to and of America. But I do mention in the press release that Americana often denotes this nostalgia and like longing feeling. But I'm curious, what exactly are we longing to return to? And who is doing this longing? Like, which groups are wanting a return to the past? Somehow this idea of Americana has been boiled down to reference old cars and diners, but it is so much more than that. We can't forget what America as a country has been built on. You'll see how the work we discussed tonight has a similar dichotomy. There's an attractive, bigger picture that makes it easy to ignore sometimes the smaller details. And we have to remember that the past is not as perfect as we all like to think it is or think it was. And we might be doing ourselves a disservice with this overarching positive idea of Americana. So this is my, Susie, muted.
Is this the first show that you've ever curated? And what were the challenges for you in doing so?
So this is the first show I've curated. I was very excited to receive this opportunity to come up with a concept and build this show from the ground up. For me, the most challenging part was to come up with a theme that was relevant to today and that many of our artists deal with, whether consciously or not. But I believe that even if you're not making work with this theme right in the back of your mind, because we all live here, it has to influence some of your work, some parts.
And you've been with the gallery now for just over a year. You know our artists intimately, all of them. How did you make your choices, your curatorial choices for the particular artists and then their work?
So our online exhibitions, as you said, this was our third one. They have really been about promoting our roster of SEFA artists. And I was trying to find a lens at which to look at our artists' work that we haven't previously. We had our first online show, Respite and Renewal, that was created by James, focused on work regarding like the physical home. And I wanted to look at this broader topic concerning the country that we call home. So you'll see tonight that you might have already looked at our website. We have photography, we have works on paper, monotypes, paintings in acrylic and acrylic ink, and everything is representational or figurative to kind of portray this difficult conceptual idea of Americana. And it is important to note that each artist did not necessarily need to represent the theme in a positive light. We can celebrate this idea of Americana, but I think it's important to also be critical as well.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Emily. You can, I think you're going to begin with Maria. Is that right?
I will, yes.
Okay.
Okay. Maria Passarocci's photographs depict small towns out west dotted with signs of life, a field with windmills generating power, a main street with a few cars parked outside the Sawtooth Club, and vast expanses of land dwarfing the buildings below it. There's a sense of satisfaction in the photographs, that man did not only settle on these lands, but conquered them. The skies couldn't be bluer, and the images seem to convey quintessential ideas of Americana, small, old-fashioned, and proud of itself. So, Maria, I noticed that all of these photos are from 2007. Can you give a little bit of context to the photos? Was this a trip you were on specifically for photo making? Where were these taken? Was this your first time?
Sure. So these photos were all part of a road trip, actually, which itself is, you know, very Americana, or to me, a longstanding American tradition. We flew into the Bay Area and then headed north along Highway 1, eventually getting to Washington State and then winding our way kind of east and then down to Yellowstone and flying out of Salt Lake City in Utah. It was over a short period of time, maybe 7 or 10 days. So it was a tremendous amount of ground to cover and a lot of driving every day with no set itinerary kind of before iPhones to figure out where you're going, and Airbnb and just a road atlas, stopping at hotels along the way and just kind of seeking out state parks, interesting looking small towns, and general sort of tourist attractions along the trip.
So you didn't necessarily have a plan of where you were going?
It was a loose plan, and that we needed to get to Yellowstone and Salt Lake City, but where we were any particular day was pretty loose.
Sorry, I was going to do that. I was going to do that.
No, sorry.
Okay, one second, everybody. I just want to interrupt. Can the people who have just joined make sure that you've muted yourself so we don't hear background noise? That would be great. Thank you so much.
Okay, so yeah, not only is the subject matter very Americana, whatever that may mean, but also the means in which you took them, the driving, the road trips, the using cars as a means of transportation. So as a photographer myself, not only am I interested in what is captured in the frame, but what doesn't make the cut. If you could speak about what you didn't photograph and why.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I thought would be a nice kind of common denominator to try to employ when I was taking these photographs was to have all of them be taken at either from roads or from designated viewing platforms in state and national parks. So this kind of idea of experiencing in a way from those viewing platforms, a curated landscape, something that was, deemed to be a, very attractive location. So you can see that in some of them. But, another thing is also just as somebody who grew up in the suburbs of New Jersey, I've done a lot of road trips since I was very young. I've spent a lot of time driving in a car, and I've often just appreciated these little glimpses of beauty that you find alongside highways, or even going through very kind of mundane areas. And so this was trying to kind of elevate that mundane landscape that you see from your car window or at the side of a highway, and, you know, cropping it in a way to really draw out that little glimpse that you might see, that little flicker that I always see driving by, that where you see beauty in something very banal.
I would like to, thank you. I would like to specifically ask a question about Number Hill. So if we can zoom in, the title is very appropriate. There are numbers on this hill. And when I saw the photo, I wasn't sure what these were marking or what these meant. Can you explain the background about this?
Sure. So we actually saw this driving by from the main highway and then found our way to this tiny little town to get a better glimpse of it. I knew immediately what it was when I saw it because there is a similar mountain, well, I'm from the East Coast, so not as mountainous as this, but where graduating seniors from high school will trek up into these areas and then, you know, generally have a party perhaps, and paint their graduating year class number on the mountain. So for me, being so far away and seeing this similar tradition was, you know, very kind of inspiring and interesting that it was something that happens, you know, potentially throughout the country. And I loved, especially with this as the backdrop in front of this, you know, little Western town with that kind of really gritty looking bar.
Okay, thank you, Maria. Charles, but we're gonna move on. So the next artist that we have, our second artist out of 4, is Charles Buckley. He sources images from the 50s and also uses his own photographs that he takes and uses acrylic ink to carefully render familiar scenes of the everyday with lines of varying thicknesses. The subjects run the gamut from elated to unbothered, relaxed to joyful, not knowing that they would become the idea that people long for to this day. Even Buckley's interiors have a sense of simpler times, a single flower arrangement, or a modest living room. So Charles, where exactly are these images from? You do have a piece titled Mom. So I'm wondering, is this an actual photograph that you found of your mom? And how are you giving these works their titles?
First of all, hello everybody, nice to be here. Thanks for coming out. No, that's not a picture of my mom. That is, I don't know who that is or where that was taken. I have no information about that photograph at all, or the original photograph. But I was sort of, you know, doing these drawings just sort of like based on these found photographs and giving them sort of these titles. You know, I'm used to giving my work very sort of utilitarian titles, and it wasn't really working for this. And I thought, like, you know, people are going to be curious about the source of the image and the narrative aspect of it. And so I thought that I could just make up some titles and
give it its own narrative, kind of guide people.
Yeah. So that, for instance, I don't know anybody named Dan.
Okay, no one named Dan. Yeah, it does really create a story. The view from Dan's place, aside from the baseball photos, which are actual, you know, photos of the games, like Grandma's TV. That seems like a very familiar image to me, even though I've never seen it. I wrote down, I feel like you're creating memories for people, like you're putting these memories inside of people, even though they've never seen this exact living room, but I'm sure everyone can imagine that their grandmother had this TV.
Yeah, I think, you know, they're all, you know, if they're not archetypes, they're based on archetypes, they're derived from archetypes. Yeah. They're all familiar enough. And, you know, it's like, it's not like you haven't, as weird as that is to say about my own work, it's like, it's not like you haven't seen this before. You've seen some version of this, right? Mm-hmm. It's familiar enough, but hopefully also like distant enough and you haven't seen it in this way.
Yeah, no, I understand. I think it does this weird thing. It plays on people. It's very familiar, but it just quite hasn't happened in reality for many people, but
Right.
they feel like shared experiences somehow. So now I have to ask like a technical question. What effect do you think rendering the images in this pattern has? And so like, why the stripes?
The lines, why, that's it sort of, if you're far away from the image, it's clear enough, right? And as you get closer to it,
Yeah.
It's almost like a mirage, I guess, right? It's like you get to it and the thing falls apart, and sort of like, if you're talking about Americana, what Americana is and how that's about, part of that is about a yearning or a longing, or like, the aching, sort of like, that's the mirage also, right? Like you want that water, but you get there and like, it's not really there. It falls apart.
Kind of an illusion.
It's an illusion, right? And so this is sort of like, the image is really an illusion, and all drawing is really an illusion. And like, it appears to be one thing, and then you get up close and all that scaffolding sort of falls away, and you can sort of get into the lines, hopefully, and it becomes something else, right? It's just like the thing that you thought you were looking at is not the thing that it actually is.
Yeah, it does kind of fall apart. That's what if anyone saw our first show of 2020 Paper Trail, where we first featured this new body of work of yours, it was very interesting to see people come into the gallery, stand very far away, get the whole picture, start slowly walking up. They would get too close, look at the stripes, and they would back up to a perfect distance where they could get the effect of the striations, and then also see the image in its entirety. So that's an effect that we can kind of get on the screen here. But if you have the opportunity to see these in person in the gallery, I do invite you in to see them.
Yeah, it was hard to sort of like grapple with that. I'm not like somebody who deals in abstraction in that way a lot, and like, I enjoy it, but it's like, I haven't been able to do that. That's just not what I do necessarily. And so to sort of like let the image fall apart at, what point is it okay to be abstract, right? And how can it sort of exist in both those worlds?
Thank you, Charles.
Sure.
Okay. At first glance, James Isherwood's paintings seem to embrace the themes of Americana. In fact, they almost feel like memories you just can't place. Vast, unknown landscapes with structures placed in the middle. Did people settle in, staking claim, and laying down roots? Or have these houses since been abandoned, the land recovering what was once rightfully belonged to itself? The saturated colors of the sky and other naturally occurring elements force the viewer to question the notion of place, reflection, and their own personal navigation of public and private. So James, when making your work, does the theme of Americana specifically cross your mind, or is this just an interpretation that I can get? Because you can get a lot of different things out of your work. I would like to hear from you.
I think it's a hybrid of places that I've been to and photographs that I've taken on travels. I also use outside source material that's photographic, and I look at a lot of architecture that's both in the real world and things that are plans for buildings, also taken mostly from the internet. And I hybridize also all three, the landscapes, and I try to make these works that look like they contain the rules of the natural world, but they really don't. And so I think they have a foreboding aspect to them, some of them. And these surreal landscapes, they evoke dreams and memories of place. Some are more quiet, and others I think have this somewhat, foreboding quality to them. And a lot of it is based on places that I've been to in the Northeast. Maine, Massachusetts, New York State, and they kind of come from being out in nature.
Yeah, for some reason, I imagine maybe it's the architecture, maybe it's these types of houses, but I do imagine them to be placed in some sort of American setting. I think it has a lot to do with the architecture, but that's immediately where my mind goes. And if just to talk about new understanding, this is made most recently in 2020. And I feel like, and for others who have followed your work, that maybe your work has gotten more surreal over the years. Not just the house that's on the other house, but these reflections coming from nowhere, and these colorful shapes that these are a 3D structure, but when you look at them, it's just a purple shape and a blue shape, and it like does this 3D effect and then a flattening effect and a 3D. So what effect does all this surrealism have on your work, and do you see it getting more surreal?
That's where it's going. It's trying to be a little bit more fantastic in this piece, and there are other pieces that I'm working on now that challenge the reality of the world that we live in, where gravity doesn't necessarily make sense, where things you see reflected in water don't exist in the background or in the further landscape. Combining these things challenges my mind, and I think challenges the viewer. In these, a lot of the buildings contain reflections of separate scenes, some that also don't make sense, ones that are coastal and mountainous in a surreal landscape. And I find that challenge exciting. The contrast between these soul buildings without any human presence. I think about what that means to be in the public sphere and in the private sphere, because you can't really access these buildings. Yet their technicolor kind of removes them from reality. And I enjoy that aspect.
It looks, now that you mention it, the human architecture is the only human presence that there is, and the lack of actual people in this is very unsettling. You're wondering where they are.
It seems as if people have almost been there or just left.
And
but there's really no evidence.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they've abandoned or what I think people try to kind of figure out what's happening, but you don't even know what's happening. Right?
Yeah, they're sort of at rest. The buildings are at rest, but having some kind of energy within them that usually reflects back on the viewer. So you're not necessarily seeing yourself, but you may feel a presence.
Yeah, the buildings take on a personality of their own. Is there any, I know we talked about new understanding, but is there any note that you'd like to make on a specific piece?
I really enjoy the piece Waking Dream. I had a lot of fun making that work. And that a more vast landscape that also is a little bit more organized in a residential way, where you're placing these minimal structures in a larger wilderness that surrounds you. Some, again, making sense with like a darker silhouette of trees in the background, and then these strange, rich, vibrant colors of an evolving foliage to the right. And then this very expansive, starry sky, evoking the Milky Way, or just being out and looking at the stars at night. But yet it also doesn't make sense because you have this reflection coming from one of the main structures, but there's no evidence of wind except in the rippling of the water. So it's both organized and sort of a strange biomorphic environment that you're in. And it makes you feel happy, as strange as it is.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, there's a lot. You have to look at each piece for the picture as a whole. But thank you, James.
Thank you, Emily.
So our fourth artist of the four, Rachel Burgess, she makes brushy depictions of fragmented landscapes that offer another idyllic view of Americana. This one includes undisturbed riverfront scenes with very little signs of human life, save for a distant lighthouse or ship. The rich, vibrant colors paint a picturesque America. The diptych, or sometimes triptych format that Burgess employs, presents the work through a sort of window pane. The viewer can stare out and lose themselves in the tableau. So Rachel, are these landscapes, are they from memory? Do you take a picture to reference later? And then can you talk about the effect that memory has on your work?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Rachel. So as far as memory versus picture goes, these pieces are actually sort of based on both. I don't use photo reference because photos are too detailed for what I'm trying to achieve. What I do is I go on location to these places, which, like Jane's, they're often in Massachusetts or Maine, which is where I'm from. And I do sketches on location in watercolor or pastel. But basically what I'm trying to do is focus on, you know, what about these familiar scenes do I edit and what do I leave in? And I couldn't get that from a photograph, but that's really what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the way we turn a real experience into a memory and sort of edit and manipulate it in our minds. So I am using pictures in the sense that I'm using my sketches, but I've been looking at these same scenes for 30 years. So in a sense, each image is also cumulative. For instance, with The Ships Come In, I'm looking at that scene right now and I probably painted it 600 times. So every time I make a new piece, all the drawings that I've done before sort of influence it in a way. And I think it's interesting that they come across as feeling untouched because the places I draw are actually, they all have sort of a human presence, like where The Ships Come In is, there's a naval base right there, there's a shipyard, tankers come through, there's a small city. Waves has, you know, houses in the distance that I edited out of the picture in my sketch. And so when I think of these places, they're actually very human. There were people and the landscape meet, but I guess perhaps that reveals something about the story I'm trying to tell with my memories. The humans sort of get edited out a bit.
That's a conscious decision to remove like the houses and the people. It doesn't.
Yeah, I don't think that hard about it, but it's sort of an instinctive artistic decision. And I guess maybe that's because that's the memory I'm taking away of these places.
So actually West really stands out to me because, like you said, most of your other work takes place on coastal landscapes with water usually. Can you give West some context?
Yes, this was based on a sketch I did in the Sierra Nevadas when I was visiting family in California. So I had never sketched it before, so it's a little different in that sense. And like a lot of my pieces, it does have a slightly darker undertone, often related to the human presence. Those hills were affected by the forest fires from a year or two ago. And so they were not as maybe beautiful or pristine as they appear in the image. And yeah, it was just, you know, it was a beautiful landscape that I decided to draw while I was there.
Yeah, and I would have never known otherwise. And they do look, I guess, to a first-time viewer, or even to me, a many-time viewer, they do look untouched, but the context really helps to understand what your thought process is when you're creating this work. And then just a quick technical question. So why do you employ the diptych or triptych technique rather than one large piece of paper?
So my process is, after making these sketches on location, I go back to a printmaking studio and I turn the drawings into large-scale monotypes. And monotype is a form of printmaking that instead of yielding 100 versions of the image, you only get one. essentially it's like an oil painting on paper. So what I do is I, in the printmaking studio, take a large sheet of plexiglass, I paint on it with oil paint, I lay a sheet of paper on top, and then I run it through a printing press, and I get essentially a grandiose stamp. And I'm limited in size by the size of the printing press. So I wanted to make really large images because I think that represents sort of the oversized impact of our memories. And the only way I could think of to do that was to start making diptychs and triptychs. But it ended up playing into my interest in memory and storytelling and sort of editing and manipulating our memories, because they remind me a little of book illustrations or panels of a screen. So I almost think of the work I'm doing as sequential art or narrative art because of this format.
And because you're essentially like stamping a piece of paper, it's the image is reversed, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the final results, these are mirror images of the actual places. And so again, it's the real place, but it's not. It's a memory versus the original experience.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you. So
That was great. Okay. Thank you all four artists so much. That was wonderful. We would love to take some questions now, or comments if you want to unmute yourself. Chase has a comment. Okay, Chase, go for it. Can you unmute yourself? One moment.
I just, the thing that I've noticed about the four artists is this expansive space, and I think of this idea of Americana, and I think people think of America as wide open spaces, and it's a metaphor for opportunity and that kind of embracing a big continent, which is a very different vision from Europe or Asia. But then just to dovetail on Susie and Emily's comments earlier, that this undertone of that this is a luxury and that isn't experienced by everyone. So it's sort of also a myth at the same time. And in the time that we're in right now with COVID, I think we're all aware that higher density often means higher rates of death and sickness with this disease, because people are piled up into many people in a tiny apartment or whatever, they're cramped and so forth. So there's this juxtaposition that I thought maybe one of the artists would like to talk about.
Anyone want to take that of the four artists?
James, come on.
Oh, there's a question.
You wait, you have to unmute, James.
Oh.
There's a question in the chat.
It's a great observation. We're all dealing with that Maria's work for me deals with this concrete vastness due to the medium. And there's one photo that's in the show where she's viewing through large evergreen trees over water into a mountainous area. And we are the viewer as she is the viewer. And it's very specific. And if you've been to the Pacific Northwest or to Maine, Massachusetts, upstate New York, you know that feel. You find yourself feeling so small. And I think a lot of us try to attempt to capture that vastness in different ways from a romantic perspective. I know that I do. I find seeing and participating and being out in nature with others to be one of the most special things. And we are very fortunate to have those things around us and to be able to go to places and do those things. And now, I think we appreciate it more now because of our confinement in this situation.
Great, thanks. We do have one question in the chat from Joseph Miraglia. Rachel Burgess mentioned painting the same scene more than 600 times. Do any of the other artists return to the same scene or concept again and again? And if so, why?
I'll speak to that. I return to the same scenes all the time, sometimes interpreting them different ways, similar to what Rachel was speaking about, but also because one of the things that's so exciting to me, and actually it piggybacks kind of on what James was just saying about experiencing the nature around us, that I love that feeling of being in a place that's so familiar, but then suddenly seeing it in a different way for some reason. And I find that the more time that, you know, I spend in a specific environment, it lends itself to that then I can see it in a new light, but I'm also bringing to it my memory and my past experience.
Right. Another question from Louise Buckley for Charles. What is your fascination with the 1950s? Why do you keep returning to that era? And in the context of today, how does that feed you? What does that give you now?
Oh, all right. I just want to clarify that not all these images are from the 50s. They somehow, like, some of them clearly are, but they go, I mean, you know, some of the images, I don't know if nothing in this show, but I've taken myself in, you know, the 2000 and aughts or teens or whatever. I don't know. I think I, you know, do have this sort of like, the design was better, like everything was sort of like cooler in the, like the best sense of the word. In like, you know, I don't know. It's just becomes an aesthetic thing. Like you sort of think like, you know, design was, there was an optimism in the design. You know, the fins on the car meant something. You know, there's like the age of the space age. You know, it was all sort of like everybody was, not everybody, but like there was this idea that we were going to move forward. And I feel like and I feel like in contemporary design, like that element of optimism doesn't exist. The other part of that, the other thing I will say is that I think it's always been hard for me to sort of look at or depict contemporary life because it's so trapped in the here and now, and it's hard to get away from that. And you know, I always think like even like the designs for the '84 Olympics, right? It's so much of that time, and it's so hard to get out of that time. And I feel like I don't know that I want to be stuck in a place and time, maybe. And that's what I would say to that.
Great, thank you. From Marcia Newfield, James, what kind of paint do you use?
They're all acrylic paints, Marcia. So they're used with a lot of watercolor techniques, a lot of thin down paint, and there's a lot of taping that happens in the work. But I use acrylic because it's very flexible.
Thank you. This is a long question from Kaylee for Rachel. Hearing about the way memory ties not only into the larger context of the exhibition, but your work in particular, brings such an amazing appreciation for your process. Knowing that monotypes have the possibility to yield ghost prints, do you ever experiment with those and the idea of the visual memory they suggest from your original monotypes? For Rachel.
Hi, thank you. I have pulled ghost prints of some works. What a ghost print is I was saying that I have my painting on plexiglass and I put paper on it and I transfer it to the paper in a one-time deal. But you can take another piece of paper and make a second print based on the remains of the painting on the plexiglass, and that's called a ghost print. And I have done that. I haven't done it recently because I do really want each piece to be one of a kind. To me, that's important for this idea of memory. You know, you had the original painting, you lose it, and this is what you get, is this new creation. But I've actually thought about that it might be really cool, especially because I'm interested in this sort of sequential, you know, developing narrative kind of art, maybe trying to make ghost prints, but going back and changing the work a bit each time so that you get a series that's all based on the same image, but each one evolves. So I appreciate the question. That might be where I'm going.
Okay, next question. For Charles from Joseph Miraglia, your works have an almost voyeuristic feel with the lines as if you were looking through the blinds into someone's life. Was that intentional? Great question.
Oh, Charles.
Yeah, I'm on mute, sorry. No, it wasn't necessarily intentional, but, you know, I think the effect of like, you know, I'm taking a lot of other people's images and yeah, I think there's something to that, even if it wasn't intentional. Yeah.
Okay, for James, you mentioned this is from Karen Young up in Boston. You mentioned your work is inspired by your travels in the Northeast. Where was the inspiration for waking?
Hi, Karen. Thank you for your question. It's a mix of Maine and upstate New York. To be able to see that sky and the tree silhouettes in places that I travel to in the Adirondacks. And my parents have a place in Maine that is surrounded by woods and deep woods. And it's the same sort of effect there of just wanting to somehow capture that in a different way that one couldn't do with photography.
Dream. Okay, a question from Anne Ray. Hi, Susan and Emily. I was fascinated by the part of the discussion about the absence of humans in many of these works, or in the case of Charles's, where humans have been obscured. It seems to suggest an Americana in which humans have been edited out. Would any of the artists perhaps speak more on what other themes this absence might?
I do use a lot of figures, but now I forgot the question, sorry.
The absence of people, what might that suggest?
Yeah, I think somebody spoke earlier to sort of the expansive landscape and you know, there's something to that is, you know, and I think that's actually something I think about a lot, like how can I give more space to these figures in there and sort of like allow them to breathe. But I think it also speaks to that sort of like that idealized landscape, right? Like that's like the thing that we long for, that we yearn for, is like that Eden, or that place of that's undisturbed. And I don't know, I think we all like have some part of that, like and maybe different aspects of that, like in our work, but yeah, that's what I got for you.
If I could
No, I'm not one of the artists, but I just want to say one thing, particularly now during this pandemic, when we have removed ourselves from people, except our, you know, maybe a partner or a child. I wonder if there was anything intentional in your selections, Emily, in thinking about that, because there is this absence of humans for the most part, with the exception of Charles's, which are blurred and obscured.
I was just thinking about that. Yeah, I don't think it was intentional. It might have been unconscious. I think one of the main ideas of Americana, one of the maybe original ideas, was this like westward expansion and taking over these vast lands that no one has been to yet, and being the first one there, and having a lot of space for yourself, having a lot of land. So I think that might have crept into my selections. Just that original idea of this westward expansion. Same with the lack of people. I think there's something to be said about being like the first one to do something, or being the first to get there, or the first to claim something. I think that also has a lot to do with it. Unintentional, but I guess it happened.
Do any of the other artists want to add to that about the lack of human presence and what that might suggest?
I would. I think that in all of them, even in Charles's that have people, you're really positioned as the viewer. So you feel like sometimes because there aren't people in the landscapes, that that you're being placed in that landscape to observe it yourself and being positioned to see it. So it kind of has that really strong sense of framing for me. Also, James, you mentioned something that I think about all the time in my work that's devoid of people, which is there's a scene that's set and it looks like something either is about to happen or just has happened, and that tension that happens there. I see that in your work, and that's something that I think is a really common theme in my work as well.
Yeah, we try to get that sweet spot.
Exactly.
Great. Okay, moving on. Next question from Stephen Perlman. Hi, Stephen. Susie, for Emily, Susie, and the artists, all of the work here uses different materials. Was the assembly of these artists and the varying approaches intentional? And do the artists ever experiment with other approaches, or are they ever influenced by such diverse materials? Pairing James and Rachel, for example, has been done at our gallery before.
Let's see, I think I can answer. Combining all the different mediums wasn't necessarily at the forefront of my mind. I didn't just didn't want 4 painters. So there is photography in there, and there is something black and white. But it wasn't necessarily my priority. It just so happened that way, and I'm very happy with the mix and the balance.
I'll just say something here that may or may not actually relate, but it doesn't matter. That I had been doing these drawings with the ink, and then I went and my initial thought was I was going to do them in pencil, and for whatever reason I didn't do it. And then I went and I saw the Via Selman show at the Met Brower, and it was like, oh my God, she's so, if you don't know her work, go look her up, and she does this incredible pencil work. And so then it was like, it kind of gave me a little bit of courage. It's like, you know, it's not going to be as beautiful as what she does, but I can give it a go, and I'll try it. So that would be a way that I would be influenced by something, I guess.
Terrific, thank you. Okay, next question from Joseph Miraglia for James. While your pieces were mostly of the Northeast, your pieces especially Desert Coast, especially evokes turn of the century settling of the Central Plains. How much are you influenced by the past?
I think there's a fair amount of the past that influences the work, but it's personal past. Places that I've been, memories that I have of places that I no longer go to or have been there recently. And it's more about the feeling of that time and place, the presence of being there and what that evokes. It's some of it is childhood related to places that I went to frequently, and others are places I'd like to go, really, but no longer exist in the same present.
Great, thank you. Okay, from Nestor Davidson, I'm curious about the moment you each begin with a work. Do you start with something final in mind, or with a technique or fragment, and then build from there? Who wants to take that first?
I can answer that because mine is very unplanned. It's very spontaneous. I see the right light on the water or fog bank or whatever it is, and I take the tools that I have at hand and quickly make a sketch. And if I'm happy with it, if I think something interesting happened, then it becomes a final piece, but it's very much based on an actual moment. And so I'm not conceptualizing a piece beforehand.
Yeah, and I'll say also that I feel like what I do is it's almost reactive in a certain way. Like I'm looking at so many photographs, I'm just like pouring through photographs, and until I find the thing in that photograph that just strikes me, and like, whatever, you know, it's one of those, you can't explain it. You can't explain it with words, but there's some poetry, there's something going on, and you just like, that's the thing that's got to make this whole drawing, right? And so that's how I do it. I look and I look, and I don't know where I'm going to go with it until I'm there. Does that make sense? I guess I don't know how to say it otherwise.
It makes sense. It's instinctual. When I start works, they're usually, I pick a color and I start making calligraphic marks, maybe starting with a sky, clouds, and eventually I know the majority of that will change, but it activates the picture plane, whether it's a wood panel or on paper. And then I kind of go from there, you know, working on multiple works at the same time. And sometimes they feed off of each other. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes you take pieces of other works that are further along than the thing that you just started. And you just kind of go from there using that instinct. Yes and no decisions, really.
Maria, do you want to take that question as well about how you begin?
Sure. I mean, this body of work actually that, you know, we're showing in this show is kind of uncommon for me, in that it was done more just by being inspired by the landscape as I experienced it. But generally, I very carefully stake out locations and repeat visit them many times. And I have a very clear vision of the scene that I want to create before I actually try to do it. You know, and then also lately I've been doing a lot more painting, and it's the same thing with the paintings. They're kind of very pre-conceptualized before I actually put any marks down on paper, with lots of kind of planned sketches and using techniques that are almost more like printmaking, which, unlike, with the exception of doing monoprints, is does require a lot of planning.
Okay, I think we have one more question from Joseph. For all of the artists, do you have a favorite piece in this particular show, and which one is it? Oh, no.
My favorite piece is Maria's piece of the trees and lake and mountain. That's the view through the evergreens. That's my favorite.
Yeah, that might be one of my favorites too. That and the her other photograph of the hillside with the cows and the windmills. Yeah, I love those photographs, both of them.
I really love some of the really abstract, James's really abstract pieces, and also Rachel's monoprints. The first time I saw them actually at Susie's, at the gallery space, they stopped me in my tracks, and I just kind of was frozen there for several minutes staring before I could get out of the hallway, I think. So I love seeing all of your work.
I love Charles's piece, Mom, and I think it's hilarious that it's not his mom, but it really captures to me what was discussed earlier about, you know, it's a person, but you don't see her face and she's looking away. And it's very, just this idealized, very nostalgic image that really spoke to me.
And here's why these are such incredible, not only artists, but people, because just to listen to you all support each other and be fans of each other's work is so gratifying. That just warms my heart. So thank you for all that. That was great. That would be a nice note to end on, unless anyone else has anything else they would like to add, say, anything? Well, thank you all. Thanks, Chase. Thank you all so much for joining. I know that the Zoom landscape in this current world is a competitive one. So thanks for joining in on ours tonight, and have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It's fabulous.
Thank you, Susie.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Emily.
Bye.